Hello, Lee here. I found a book called Island of the Blue Dolphins by a fellow called Scott Odell. Um, it's public domain, and it's an interesting looking book. I thought we might enjoy it, so I'm going to read it to you. I remember the day the Aleut ship came to our island. At first it seemed like a small shell afloat on the sea. Then it grew larger and was a gull with folded wings. At last, in the rising sun, it became what it really was, a red ship with two red sails. My brother and I had gone to the head of a canyon that winds down to a little harbour which is called Coral Cove. We had gone to gather roots that grew there in the spring. My brother Ramo was only a little boy, half my age, which was 12. He was small for one who had lived so many suns and moons, but quick as a cricket, also foolish as a cricket when he was excited. For this reason, and because I wanted him to help me gather roots and not go running off, I said nothing about the shell I saw or the gull with folded wings. I went on digging in the brush with my pointed stick as though nothing at all were happening on the sea, even when I knew for sure that the gull was a ship with two red sails. But Ramo's eyes missed little in the world. They were black like a lizard's, and very large, and like the eyes of a lizard, could sometimes look sleepy. This was the time when they saw the most. This was the way they looked now. They were half closed, like those of a lizard lying on a rock about to flick out its tongue to catch a fly. The sea is smooth, Ramo said. It is a flat stone without any scratches. My brother liked to pretend that one thing was another. The sea is not a stone without scratches, I said. It is water and no waves. To me it is a blue stone, he said, and far away on the edge of it is a small cloud which sits on the stone. Clouds do not sit on stones, on blue ones or black ones or any kind of stones. This one does. Not on the sea, I said. Dolphins sit there, and gulls and cormorants and otter and whales too, but not clouds. It is a whale, maybe. Ramo was standing on one foot and then the other, watching the ship coming, which he did not know was a ship because he had never seen one. I had never seen one either, but I knew how they looked because I had been told. While you gaze at the sea, I said, I dig roots, and it is I who will eat them and you who will not. Who will not? Ramo began to punch at the earth with his stick, but as the ship came closer, its sails showing red through the morning mist, he kept watching it, acting all the time as if he were not. Have you ever seen a red whale? He asked. Yes, I said, though I never had. Those I have seen are grey. You are very young and have not seen everything that swims in the world. Ramo picked up a root and was about to drop it into the basket. Suddenly his mouth opened wide and then closed again. A canoe, he cried. A great one, bigger than all of our canoes together, and red. A canoe or a ship, it did not matter to Ramo. In the very next breath he tossed the root in the air and was gone, crashing through the brush, shouting as he went. I kept on gathering roots, but my hands trembled as I dug in the earth, for I was more excited that way than my brother. I knew that it was a ship there on the sea, and not a big canoe, and that a ship could mean many things. I wanted to drop the stick and run too, but I went on digging roots, because they were needed in the village. By the time I filled the basket, the Aleut ship had sailed around the wide kelp bed that enclosed our island and between the two rocks that guard Coral Cove. Word of its coming had already reached the village of Galas At. Carrying their weapons, our men sped along the trail which winds down to the shore. Our women were gathering at the edge of the mesa. I made my way through the heavy brush and moving swiftly down the ravine until I came to the sea cliffs. There I crouched on my hands and knees. Below me lay the cove. The ship was out and the sun shone on the white sand of the beach. Half the men from our village stood at the water's edge. The rest were concealed among the rocks at the foot of the trail, ready to attack the intruders should they prove unfriendly. As I crouched there in the toyon bush, trying not to fall over the cliff, trying to keep myself hidden and yet to see and hear what went on below me, a boat left the ship. 6 men with long oars were rowing. Their faces were broad, and shining dark hair fell over their eyes. When they came closer, I saw that they had bone ornaments thrust through their noses. Behind them in the boat stood a tall man with a yellow beard. I had never seen a Russian before, but my father had told me about them, and I wondered, seeing the way he stood with his feet set apart and his fists on his hips, and looked at the little harbour as though it already belonged to him, if he were one of those men from the north whom our people feared. I was certain of it when the boat slid in to the shore and he jumped out, shouting as he did so. His voice echoed against the rock walls of the cove. The words were strange, unlike any I'd ever heard. Slowly then he spoke in our tongue. "I come in peace and wish to parley," he said to the men on the shore. None of them answered, but my father, who was one of those hidden among the rocks, came forward down the sloping beach. He thrust his spear into the sand. "I am the chief of Gallas At," he said. "My name is Chief Chowig." I was surprised that he gave his real name to a stranger. Everyone in our tribe had 2 names, the real one, which was secret and was seldom used, and one which was common, for if people use your secret name, it becomes worn out and loses its magic. Thus I was known as Wanapale, which means the girl with the long black hair, though my secret name is Karana. My father's secret name was Chowig. Why he gave it to a stranger I do not know. The Russian smiled and held up his hand, calling himself Captain Orlov. My father also held up his hand. I could not see his face, but I doubted that he smiled in return. "I have come with 40 of my men," said the Russian. "We come to hunt sea otter. We wish to camp on your island while we are hunting." My father said nothing. He was a tall man, though not so tall as Captain Orlov, and he stood with his bare shoulders thrown back, thinking about what the Russian had said. He was in no hurry to reply because the Aleuts had come before to hunt otter. That was long in the past, but my father still remembered them. "You remember another hunt," Captain Orlov said when my father was silent. "I have heard of it too. It was led by Captain Mitref, who was a fool and is now dead. The trouble arose because you and your tribe did all of the hunting." "We hunted," said my father, "but the one you call a fool wished us to hunt from one moon to the next, never ceasing." "This time you will need to do nothing," Captain Orlov said. "My men will hunt, and we will divide the catch. 1 part for you, to be paid in goods, and 2 parts for us. The parts must be equal," my father said. Captain Orlov gazed off towards the sea. "We can talk of that later when my supplies are safe ashore," he replied. The morning was fair with little wind, yet it was the season of the year when storms could be looked for, so I understood why the Russian wished to move onto our island. "It is better to agree now," said my father. Captain Orlov took 2 long steps away from my father, then turned and faced him. 1 part to you is fair, since the work is ours and ours the risk." My father shook his head. The Russian grasped his beard. "Since the sea is not yours, why do I have to give you any part?" "The sea which surrounds the island of the blue dolphins belongs to us," answered my father. He spoke softly, as he did when he was angry. From here to the coast of Barbara, 20 leagues away? No, no, only that which touches the island and where the otter live. Captain Orlov made a sound in his throat. He looked at our men standing on the beach and toward those who had now come from behind the rocks. He looked at my father and shrugged his shoulders. Suddenly he smiled, showing his long teeth. The parts shall be equal, he said. He said more, but I did not hear it. For at that instant, in my great excitement, I moved a small rock, which clattered down the sea and fell at his feet. Everyone on the beach looked up. Suddenly I left the toyon bushes and ran without stopping until I reached the mesa. Captain Orlov and his Aleut hunters moved to the island that morning, making many trips from their ship to the beach of Coral Cove. Since the beach was small and almost flooded when the tide was in, he asked if he could camp on higher ground. This my father agreed to. Perhaps I should tell you about our island, so you will know how it looks, and where our village was, and where the Aleuts camped for most of the summer. Our island is 2 leagues long and 1 league wide, and if you were standing on one of the hills that rise in the middle of it, you would think that it looked like a fish, like a dolphin lying on its side, with its tail pointing toward the sunrise, its nose pointing to the sunset, and its fins making reefs and the rocky ledges along the shore. Whether someone did stand there on the low hills in the days when the earth was new, and because of its shape, called it the island of the blue dolphin. I do not know. Hang on, that doesn't make sense. Whether someone did stand there on the low hills in the days when the earth was new, and because of its shape, called it the island of the blue dolphin, I do not know. Many dolphins live in our seas, and it may be from them that the name came, but one way or another, this is what the island was called. The first thing you would notice about our island, I think, is the wind. It blows almost every day, sometimes from the northwest and sometimes from the east, once in a long while out of the south. All the winds except the one from the south are strong, and because of them the hills are polished smooth and the trees are small and twisted, even in the canyon that runs down to Coral Cove. The village of Galas-At lay east of the hills on a small mesa near Coral Cove and a good spring. About a half league to the north is another spring, and it was there that the Aleuts put up their tents, which were made of skins and were so low to the earth that the men had to crawl into them on their stomachs. At dusk we could see the glow of their fires. That night my father warned everyone in the village of Galas-At against visiting the camp. The Aleuts come from a country far to the north, he said. Their ways are not ours, nor is their language. They have come to take otter and to give us our share in many goods which they have and which we can use. In this way shall we profit, but we shall not profit if we try to befriend them. They are people who do not understand friendship. They are not those who were here before, but they are people of the same tribe that caused trouble many years ago. My father's words were obeyed. We did not go to the Aleut camp, and they did not come to our village. But this is not to say that we did not know what they did, what they ate, and in what way they cooked it, how many otters were killed each day, and on other things as well. For someone was always watching from the cliffs while they were hunting, or from the ravine when they were in camp. Ramo, for instance, brought news about Captain Orlov. In the morning, when he crawls out of his tent, he sits on a rock and combs until the beard shines like a cormorant's wing, Ramo said. My sister Ulape, who was 2 years older than I, gathered the most curious news of all. She swore that there was an Aleut girl among the hunters. She is dressed in skins, just like the men, Ulape said, but she wears a fur cap, and under the cap she has thick hair that falls to her waist. No one believed Ulape. Everyone laughed at the idea that hunters would bother to bring their wives with them. The Aleuts also watched our village, otherwise they would not have known about the good fortune which befell us soon after they came. It happened this way. Early spring is a poor season for fishing. The heavy seas and winds of winter drive the fish into deep water, where they stay until the weather is settled and where they are hard to catch. During this time the village eats sparingly, mostly from stores of seeds harvested in autumn. Word of our good fortune came on a stormy afternoon, brought by Ulape, who was never idle. She had gone to a ledge on the eastern part of the island, hoping to gather shellfish. She was climbing a cliff on the way home when she heard a loud noise behind her. At first she did not see what had caused the noise. She thought that it was the wind echoing through one of the caves, and was about to leave when she noticed silvery shapes on the floor of the cove. The shapes moved, and she saw that it was a school of large white bass, each one as big as she was, pursued by killer whales, which prey upon them when seals are not to be found. The bass had tried to escape by swimming towards shore, but in their terror they had mistaken the depth of the water and had been tossed onto the rocky ledge. Ulape dropped her basket of shellfish and set out for the village, arriving there so out of breath that she could only point in the direction of the shore. The women were cooking supper, but all of them stopped and gathered around her, waiting for her to speak. "A school of white bass," she finally said. "Where? Where?" everyone asked. "On the rocks, a dozen of them, perhaps more than a dozen." Before Ulape had finished speaking, we were running towards the shore, hoping that we would get there in time, that the fish had not flopped back into the sea, or that a chance wave had not washed them away. We came to the cliff and looked down. The school of white bass was still on the ledge, glistening in the sun. But since the tide was high and the biggest waves were already lapping at the fish, there was no time to lose. One by one we hauled them out of reach of the tide. Then two women carrying a single fish, for they were all of about the same size and heavy, that we lifted them up the cliff and brought them home. There were enough for everyone in our tribe for supper that night and the next, but in the morning 2 Aleuts came to the village and asked to speak to my father. "You have fish," one of them said. "Enough only for my people," my father answered. "You have 14 fish," the Aleut said. "7 now, because we ate 7. From 7 you can spare 2. "There are 40 in your camp," my father replied, "and more than that of us. Besides, you have your own fish, the dried ones that you brought. We tire of that kind," the Aleut said. He was a short man who only came to my father's shoulders, and he had small eyes like black pebbles and a mouth like the edge of a stone knife. The other Aleut looked very much like him. "You are hunters," my father said. "Go and hunt your own fish. If you are tired of what you are now eating, go and hunt your own fish. If you are tired of what you are now eating, I have my people to think of. Captain Orlov will hear that you refuse to share the fish." "Yes, tell him," my father said, "but also why we refuse." The Aleut grunted to his companion, and the two of them stalked off on their short legs across the sand dunes that lay between the village and their camp. We ate the rest of the white bass that night, and there was much rejoicing. But little did we know, as we ate and sang and the older men told stories around the fire, that our good fortune would soon bring trouble to gallus at. The wide beds of kelp which surround our island on 3 sides come close to the shore and spread out to sea for a distance of a league. In these deep beds, even on days of heavy winds, the Aleut hunted. They left the shore at dawn in their skin canoes and did not return until night, towing after them the slain otter. The sea otter, which it is when it is swimming, looks like a seal, but it is really very different. It has a shorter nose than a seal, small webbed feet instead of flippers, and fur that is thicker and much more beautiful. It is also different in other ways. The otter likes to lie on its back in the kelp beds, floating up and down to the motion of the waves, sunning itself or sleeping. They are the most playful animals in the sea. It was these creatures the Aleuts hunted for their pelts. From the cliff I could see the skin canoes darting here and there over the kelp beds, barely skimming the water, and the long spears flying like arrows. At dark the hunters brought their catch into Coral Cove, and there on the beach the animals were skinned and fleshed. Two men who also sharpened the spears did this work, labouring far into the night by the light of seaweed fires. In the morning the beach would be strewn with carcasses and the waves red with blood. Many of our tribe went to the cliff each night to count the number of killed during the day. They counted the dead otter and thought of the beads and other things that each pelt meant. But I never went to the cove, and whenever I saw the hunters with their long spears skimming over the water, I was angry, for these animals were my friends. It was fun to see them playing or sunning themselves among the kelp. It was more fun than the thought of beads to wear around my neck. This I told my father one morning. There are scarcely a dozen left in the beds around Coral Cove, I said. Before the Aleuts came here there were many. Many still live in other places around the island, he replied, laughing at my foolishness. When the hunters leave, they will come back. There will be none left, I said. The hunters will kill them all. This morning they hunt on the south. Next week they will move to another place. The ship is filled with pelts. In another week the Aleuts will be ready to go. I was sure that my father thought that they would leave soon, for 2 days before he had sent some of our young men to the beach to build a canoe from a log which had drifted in from the sea. There are no trees on the island except the small ones stunted by the wind. When a log came ashore, as happened once in a long time, it was always carried to the village and worked on where a chance wave could not wash it away. Then the men were sent to hollow out the log in the cove, and to sleep beside it during the night meant that they were there to watch the Aleuts, to give the alarm should Captain Orlov try to sail off without paying us for the otter skins. Everyone was afraid he might, so besides the men in the cove who watched the Aleut ship, others kept watch on the camp. Every hour someone brought news. Ulapi said that the Aleut woman spent a whole afternoon cleaning her skin aprons, which she had not done before while she had been there. Early one morning Ramo said he had just seen Captain Orlov carefully trimming his beard so that it looked the way it did when he first came. The Aleuts, who sharpened the long spears, stopped this work and gave all their time to skinning the otter, which were brought in at dusk. We in the village of Galas At knew that Captain Orlov and his hunters were getting ready to leave the island. Would he pay us for the otter he had slain, or would he try to sneak away in the night? Would our men have to fight for our rightful share? These questions everyone asked while the Aleuts went about their preparations. Everyone except my father, who said nothing, but each night worked on the new spear he was making. Sip of water. The Aleuts left on a sunless day. Out of the north deep, waves rolled down upon the island. They broke against the rocks and roared into the caves, sending up white sprays of water. Before night a storm would certainly strike. Not long after dawn, the Aleuts took down their skin tents and carried them to the beach. Captain Orlov had not paid my father for the otter he had killed, so when the news came that the hunters had packed their tents, all of our tribe left the village and hurried towards Coral Cove. The men with their weapons went first, and the women followed. The men took the trail that led to the beach, but the women hid themselves among the bushes, among the brush on the cliff. Ulape and I went together far out on the ledge where I had hidden before when the hunters first came. The tide was low, and the rocks and the narrow beach were scattered with bundles of otter pelts. Half of the hunters were on the ship. The rest were wading into the water, tossing the pelts into a boat. The Aleuts laughed while they worked, as if they were happy to leave the island. My father was talking to Captain Orlov. I could not hear their words because of the noise the hunters made, but from the way my father shook his head, I knew that he was not pleased. "He is angry," Ulape whispered. "Not yet," I said. "When he's really angry, he pulls his ear." The men who were working on the canoe had stopped and were watching my father and Captain Orlov. The other men of our tribe stood at the foot of the trail. The boat went off to the ship filled with otter. As it reached the ship, Captain Orlov raised his hand and gave a signal. When the boat came back, it held a black chest which two of the hunters carried to the beach. Captain Orlov raised the lid and pulled out several necklaces. There was little light in the sky, yet the beads sparkled as he turned them this way and that. Beside me, Ulape drew in her breath in excitement, and I can hear cries of delight from the women hidden in the brush. But the cries suddenly ceased as my father shook his head and turned his back on the chest. The Aleuts stood silent. Our men left their places at the foot of the trail and moved forward a few steps and waited, watching my father. "One string of beads for one otter pelt is not our bargain," my father said. "One string and one iron spearhead," said Captain Orlov, lifting two fingers. "The chest does not hold that much," my father answered. "There are more chests on the ship," said the Russian. "Then bring them to the shore," my father said. "You have had 105 bales of otter on the ship. There are 15 here in the cove. You will need 3 more chests of this size." Captain Orlov had said something to his Aleuts that I could not understand, but its meaning was soon clear. There were many hunters in the cove, and as soon as he spoke, they began to carry the otter pelts to the shore. Beside me, Ulape was scarcely breathing. "Do you think that he will give us the other chests?" she whispered. "I do not trust him. When he gets the pelts to the shore, he may leave. It is possible." The hunters had to pass my father to reach the boat, and when the first one approached him, he stepped in his path. "The rest of the pelts must stay here," he said, facing Captain Orlov, "until the chests are brought." The Russian drew himself up stiffly and pointed to the clouds that were blowing in towards the island. "I load the ship before the storm arrives," he said. "Give us the other chests, and I will help you with our canoes," my father replied. Captain Orlov was silent. His gaze moved slowly around the cove. He looked at our men standing on the ledge of rock a dozen paces away. He looked up towards the cliff and back at my father. Then he spoke to his Aleuts. I do not know what happened first, whether it was my father who raised his hand against the hunter who party barred, whether it was this man who stepped forward with a bale of pelts on his back and shoved my father aside. It all happened so quickly that I could not tell one act from the other. But as I jumped to my feet and Ulape screamed and other cries sounded along the cliff, I saw a figure lying on the rocks. It was my father, and blood was on his face. Slowly he got to his feet. With their spears raised, our men rushed down across the ledge. A puff of white smoke came from the deck of the ship. A loud noise echoed against the cliff. 5 of our warriors fell and lay quiet. Ulape screamed again and flung a rock into the cove. It fell harmlessly beside Captain Orlov. Rocks showered into the cove from many places among the cliffs, striking several of the hunters. Then our warriors rushed in upon them, and it was hard to tell one from the other. Ulape and I stood on the cliff and watched helplessly, afraid to use the rocks we held lest we injure our own men. The Aleuts had dropped the bales of otter. They drew knives from their belts, and as our warriors rushed upon them, the 2 lines surged back and forth along the beach. Men fell to the sand and rose to fight again. Others fell and did not get up. My father was one of these. For a long time it seemed that we would win the battle, but Captain Orlov, who had rowed off to the ship when the battle started, returned with more of his Aleuts. Our warriors were forced backwards to the cliffs. There were few of them left, yet they fought at the foot of the hill, and would not retreat. The wind began to blow. Suddenly Captain Orlov and his Aleuts turned and ran to the boat. Our men did not pursue them. The hunters reached the ship. The red sails went up, and the ship moved slowly between the 2 rocks that guarded the cove. Once more before it disappeared, a white puff of smoke rose from the deck. As Ulape and I ran along the cliff, a whirring sound like a great bird in flight passed above our heads. The storm struck as we ran, driving rain into our faces. Then other women were running beside us, and their cries were louder than the wind. At the bottom of the trail we came upon our warriors. Many had fought on the beach. Few had left it, and of these all were wounded. My father lay on the beach, and the waves were already washing over him. Looking at his body, I knew he should not have told Captain Orlov his secret name, and back in our village all the weeping women and the sad men agreed that this had so weakened him that he had not lived through the fight with the Aleuts and the dishonest Russian. That night was the most terrible time in all the memory of Galas-At. When the fateful day had dawned, the tribe numbered 42 men, counting those who were too old to fight. When night came and the women had carried back to the village those who had died on the beach of Coral Cove, there remained only 15. Of these, 7 were old men. There was no woman who had not lost a father or a husband, a brother or a son. The storm lasted 2 days, and the 3rd day we buried our dead on the south headland. The Aleuts who had fallen on the beach we burned. For many days after that the village was quiet. People went out only to gather food and came back to eat in silence. Some wished to leave and go in their canoes to the islands called Santa Catalina, which lies far off to the east. But others said that there was little water on that island. In the end a council was held, and it was decided to stay at Galas-At. The council also chose a new chief to take my father's place. His name was Kimki. He was very old, but he had been a good man in his youth, and a good hunter. The night he was chosen to be chief, he called everyone together, saying, "Most of those who snared fowl and found fish in the deep water and built canoes are gone. The women who were never asked to do more than stay at home, cook food and make clothing, now must take the place of the men and face the dangers which abound beyond the village. There will be grumbling in Galas-At because of this. There will be shirkers. These will be punished, for without the help of all must perish." Kimki portioned work for each one in the tribe, giving Ulape and me the task of gathering abalones. This shellfish grew on the rocks along the shore and was plentiful. We gathered them at low tide in baskets and carried them to the mesa, where we cut baskets and carried them to the mesa. Kimki portioned work for each one in the tribe, giving Ulape and me the task of gathering abalones. This shellfish grew on the rocks along the shores and was plentiful. We gathered them at low tide in baskets and carried them to the mesa, where we cut the dark red flesh from the shell and placed it on flat rocks to dry in the sun. Ramo had the task of keeping the abalones safe from the gulls, and especially the wild dogs. Dozens of our animals, which had left the village when their owners had died, joined the wild pack that roamed the island. They soon grew as fierce as the wild ones, and only came back to the village to steal food. Each day toward evening, Ulape and I helped Ramo put the abalones in baskets and carry them to the village for safekeeping. During this time, other women were gathering the scarlet apples that grow on the cactus bushes and are called tunas. Fish were caught and many birds were netted. So hard did the women work that we really fared better than before, when the hunting was done by the men. Life in the village should have been peaceful, but it was not. The men said that the women had taken the tasks that rightfully were theirs, and now that they had become hunters, the men looked down upon them. There was much trouble over this until Kimki decreed that the work would again be divided. Henceforth the men would hunt and the women harvest. Since there was already ample food to last through the winter, it no longer mattered who hunted. But this was not the real reason why autumn and winter were unpeaceful at Gallas At. Those who had died at Coral Cove were still with us. Everywhere we went on the island or on the sea, whether we were fishing or eating or sitting by the fires at night, they were with us. We all remembered someone, and I remembered my father, so tall and strong and kind. A few years ago my mother had died, and since then Ulape and I had tried to do the tasks she had done. Ulape even more than I, being older. Now that my father was gone, it was not easy to look after Ramo, who was always into some mischief. It was the same in the other houses at Gallas At, but more than the burdens which had fallen upon us all, it was the memory of those who had gone that burdened our hearts. After food had been stored in autumn and the baskets were full in every house, there was more time to think about them, so that a sort of sickness came over the village, and people sat and did not speak, nor even laughed. In the spring, Kimki called the tribe together. He had been thinking, he said, during the winter, and had decided that he would take a canoe and go to the east to a country which was there and which he had once been to when he was a boy. It lay many days across the sea, but he would go there and make a place for us. He would go alone, because he could not spare more of our men for the voyage, and he would return. The day that Kimki left was fair. We all went to the cove and watched him launch the big canoe. It held 2 baskets of water and enough tunas and dried abalone to last many days. We watched while Kimki paddled through the narrow opening in the rocks. Slowly he went through the kelp beds, and into the sea. There he waved to us and we waved back. The rising sun made a silver trail across the water. Along this trail he disappeared into the east. The rest of the day we talked about the journey. Would Kimki ever reach this far country about which nothing was known? Would he come back before the winter was over, or never? That night we sat around the fire and talked while the wind blew and the waves crashed against the shore. After Kimki had been gone 1 moon, we began to watch for his return. Every day someone went to the cliff to scan the sea. Even on stormy days we went, and on days when the fog shrouded the island. During the day there was always a watcher on the cliff, and each night as we sat around our fires we wondered if the next sun would bring him home. But the spring came and left, and the sea was empty. Kimki did not return. There were few storms that winter, and rain was light and ended early. This meant that we would need to be careful of water. In the old days, the springs sometimes ran low and no one was worried, but now everything seemed to cause alarm. Many were afraid that we would die of thirst. There are other things more important to ponder, said Matasiep, who had taken Kimki's place. Matasiep meant the Aleuts, for it was now the time of year when they had come before. Watchers on the cliffs began to look for the red sails, and a meeting was held to plan what to do if the Aleuts came. We lacked the men to keep them from landing or to save our lives if they attacked us, which we were certain they would. Plans were therefore made to flee as soon as their ship was sighted. Sip of water. Food and water were stored in canoes, and these were hidden on the rocks at the south end of the island. The cliffs were steep here and very high, but we wove a stout rope of bull kelp and fastened it to rocks at the top of the cliff so that it hung to the water. As soon as the Aleut ship was sighted, we would all go to the cliff and let ourselves down one at a time. We would then leave in our canoes for the island of Santa Catalina. Although the entrance to Coral Cove was far too narrow for a ship to pass through safely at night, men were sent there to watch the cove from dusk to dawn, besides those who watched during the day. Shortly afterwards, on a night of fine moon, one of the men came running back to the village. Everyone was asleep, but his cries quickly awakened us. "The Aleuts," he shouted, "the Aleuts!" It was news we expected. We were prepared for it, yet there was much fear in the village of Gallas At. Matasiep strode from hut to hut, telling everyone to be calm and not to lose time packing things that would not be needed. I took my skirt of yucca fibre, however, for I had spent many days making it, and it was very pretty, and also my otter cape. Quietly we filed out of the village along the trail that led toward the place where our canoes were hidden. The moon was growing pale, and there was a faint light in the east, but a strong wind began to blow. We had gone no farther than half a league when we were overtaken by the man who had given the warning. He came to Matasiep, but we all gathered around to listen to him. "I went back to the cove after I gave the alarm," he said. "When I got there I could see the ship clearly. It is beyond the rocks that guard the harbour. It is a smaller ship than the one which belonged to the Aleuts. The sails are white instead of red." "Could you see anyone?" Matasiep asked. "No." "It is not the same ship which was here last spring?" "No." Matasiep was silent, pondering the news. Then he told us all to go on to where the canoes were and wait for him, for he was going back. It was light now, and we went quickly over the dunes to the edge of the cliff and stood there while the sun rose. The wind grew cold, but fearing that those on the ship would see the smoke, we did not start a fire, though we had a meal to cook for breakfast. Instead, we ate a small quantity of dried abalone, and afterwards my brother Ramo climbed over the cliff. No one had been down to the rocks since the canoes were hidden, so we did not know whether they were still safe or not. While he was gone, we saw a man running across the dunes. It was Nanko, carrying a message from Matasiep. He was sweating in spite of the cold, and he stood trying to catch his breath. We all waited, urging him to talk, but his face was happy, and we knew that he brought good news. "Speak," everyone said in a chorus. "I've been running for more than a league," he said. "I cannot talk." "You are talking," someone said. "Speak, Nanko, speak." Nanko was having fun with us. He threw out his chest and took a deep breath. He looked round at the circle of faces, as if he did not understand why everyone was staring at him. The ship, he said at last, saying the words slowly, does not belong to our enemies, the Aleuts. There are white men on this ship, and they have come from that place where Kimki went when he left our island. Has Kimki returned? An old man broke in. No, but it is he who saw the white men and told them to come here. What do they look like? Are there boys on the ship? Asked Ramo, who had come back with his mouth full of something. Everyone seemed to be talking at once. Namco made his face stern, which was hard for him to do because his mouth had been cut in the battle with the Aleuts, and ever since it had always seemed to smile. He held up his hand for silence. The ship has come for one reason, he said, to take us away from Galus At. To what place? I said. It was good news that the ship did not belong to the Aleuts, but where would the white men take us? I do not know what place, he said. Kimki knows, and he has asked the white men to take us there. Saying no more, Nanko turned back and we followed him. We were fearful of where we were going, yet we were happy too. We took nothing with us when we thought we would have to flee, so there was much excitement as we packed our baskets. Nanko strode up and down outside the houses, urging us to hurry. The wind grows strong, he shouted. The ship will leave you. I filled 2 baskets with the things I wished to take. 3 fine needles of whalebone, and all for making holes, a good stone knife for scraping hides, 2 cooking pots, a small box made from a shell with many earrings in it. Ulape had 2 boxes of earrings, for she was vainer than I, and when she put them into her baskets, she drew a thin mark with blue clay across her nose and cheekbones. The mark meant that she was unmarried. The ship leaves, shouted Nanko. If it goes, Ulapi shouted back, it will come again after the storm. My sister was in love with Nanko, but she laughed at him. Other men will come to the island, she said. They will be far more handsome and brave than those who leave. You are all women of such ugliness that they will be afraid and soon go away. The wind blew in fierce gusts as we left the village, stinging our faces with sand. Ramo hopped along far in front of one of our baskets, but before long he ran back to say that he had forgotten his fishing spear. Nanko was standing on the cliff, motioning us to hurry, so I refused to let him go back for it. The ship was anchored outside the cove, and Nanko said that it would not come closer to the shore because of the high waves. They were beating against the rocks with the sound of thunder. The shore, as far as I could see, was rimmed with foam. 2 boats were pulled up on the beach. Beside them stood 4 white men, and as we came down the trail, one of them beckoned us to walk faster. He spoke to us in a language which we could not understand. The men of our tribe, except Nanko and Chief Matasape, were already on the ship. My brother Ramo was there too. Nanko said. He had run on ahead after I told him that he would not go back to the village for his spear. Nanko said that he had jumped into the first boat that left the cove. Matasape divided the women into 2 groups. Then the boats were pushed into the water, and while they bobbed about, we scrambled into them as best we could. The cove was partly sheltered from the wind, but as soon as we went through the passage between the rocks and into the sea, great waves struck us. There was much confusion. Spray flew and the white men shouted at each other. The boat pitched so wildly that in one breath you could see the ship, and in the next breath it was gone. Yet we came to it at last, and somehow were able to climb onto the deck. The ship was large, many times the size of our biggest canoes. It had two tall masts, and between them stood a young man with blue eyes and a black beard. He was the chieftain of the white men, for he began to shout orders, which they quickly obeyed. Sails rose on the tall masts, and two of the men began to pull on the rope that held the anchor. I called to my brother, knowing that he was very curious, and therefore would be in the way of the men who were working. The wind drowned my voice, and he did not answer. The deck was so crowded that it was hard to move, but I went from one end of it to the other, calling his name. Still there was no answer. No one had seen him. At last I found Nanko. I was overcome with fear. "Where is my brother?" I cried. He repeated what he had told me on the beach, but as he spoke, Ulape, who stood beside him, pointed towards the island. I looked out across the deck and the sea. There, running along the cliff, the fishing spear held over his head, was Ramo. The sails had filled and the ship was now moving slowly away. Everyone was looking towards the cliff, even the white men. I ran to one of them and pointed, but he shook his head and turned from me. The ship began to move faster. Against my will, I screamed. Chief Mataseip grasped my arm. "We cannot wait for Ramo," he said. "If we do, the ship will be driven on the rocks." "We must," I shouted. "We must." "The ship will come back for him on another day," Mataseip said. "He will be safe. There is food for him to eat and water to drink and places to sleep." "No," I cried. Mataseip's face was like stone. He was not listening. I cried out once more, but my voice was lost in the howling wind. People gathered around me, saying again what Mataseip had said, yet I was not comforted by their words. Ramo had disappeared from the cliff, and I knew that he was now running along the beach that led to along the trail that led to the beach. The ship began to circle the kelp bed, and I thought surely that it was going to return to the shore. I held my breath, waiting. Then slowly its direction changed. It pointed toward the east. At that moment I walked across the deck, and though many hands tried to hold me back, flung myself into the sea. A wave passed over my head, and I went down and down until I thought I would never behold the day again. The ship was far away when I rose. Only the sails showed through the spray. I was still clutching the basket that held all of my things, but it was very heavy, and I realized that I could not swim with it in my arms. Letting it sink, I started off towards the shore. I could barely see the two rocks that guarded the entrance to Coral Cove, but I was not fearful. Many times I had swum further than this, although not in a storm. I kept thinking over and over as I swam how I would punish Ramo when I reached the shore, yet when I felt the sand under my feet and saw him standing on the edge of the waves, holding his fishing spear and looking so forlorn, I forgot all those things I planned to do. Instead, I fell to my knees and put my arms around him. The ship had disappeared. "When will it come back?" Ramo asked. There were tears in his eyes. "Soon," I said. The only thing that made me angry was that my beautiful skirt of yucca fibers, which I had worked on so long and carefully, was ruined. The wind blew strong as we climbed the trail, covering the mesa with sand that sifted around our legs and shut out the sky. Since it was not possible to find our way back, we took shelter among some rocks. We stayed there until night fell. Then the wind lessened and the moon came out, and by its light we reached the village. The huts looked like ghosts in the cold light. As we neared them, I heard a strange sound like that of running feet. I thought that it was a sound made by the wind, but when we came closer, I saw dozens of wild dogs scurrying around through the huts. They ran from us, snarling as they went. The pack must have slunk into the village soon after we left, for it had gorged itself upon the abalone we had not taken. It had gone everywhere searching for food, and Ramo and I had to look hard to find enough for our supper. When we ate beside a small fire, I could hear the dogs on the hill not far away, and through the night their howls came to me on the wind. But when the sun rose and I went out of the hut, the pack trotted off towards its lair, which was at the north side of the island in a large cave. That day we spent gathering food,